Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yongki. I'm a senior associate Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to talk about E-2 visa investor requirement and renewal considerations. I'll be covering the first half of the presentation, and then for the other half of presentation, we are very lucky to have our firm's partner, Kelly Weiner, who will go over more specific examples and considerations. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer services in a wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, L1, H1B, and any types of employment or family-based green card cases. Especially, we have built very strong reputations in the E-2 visa world. We have processed thousands of E-2 visas. Many of them were high-risk cases, and we have worked with the U.S. consular offices all over the world. Our firm actually even wrote a book about the consular process, E-2 visa consular processing. Well, one particular reason for this focus is that our firm was established on an E2 visa by our firm's founder Ian Scott himself. And that's why we know a lot about the E2 visa world. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you several useful tools. A copy of PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today, a link where you can download the guidelines with more details on visa options, a link to sign up for the additional webinars, a link to webinar recording on YouTube. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post immigration-related videos. And finally, a link where you can set up a private consultation with us. Finally, for any questions, please type them into chat box or Q&A box. We'll address all the questions at the end of presentation. And with that, let's get started. So E2 visa requirement. E2 visa is basically great visa for the entrepreneurs. You have to be a national of a treaty country, and currently United States have signed the treaty agreement with more than 80 countries. The list of E2 countries occasionally change, but not that often. But every like a few years, a few countries would be added and fall off from the list. So you should check the official E2 country list before you actually submit your E2 visa application. But keep in mind that you do not need to be born from the treaty country. You just need to hold a passport from one of the treaty countries. So for example, let's say you were born in India, which is not a treaty country with the United States yet, but let's say you later immigrant to Canada and have a Canadian passport right now. Then you are eligible for the E2 visa. And you must own at least 50%, half of the E2 company's ownerships, and must be actively participating in the business operation. You cannot be just passive shareholder for the over the E2 company. The next requirement is that you must make a substantial investment. Then what is the substantial investment? Well, we'll talk about it more detail later, but generally speaking, it means that sufficient amount to make the E2 business fully operational. That's the kind of definition. Fund must be at risk. This means you actually need to spend the money. You cannot claim an investment when you wire transfer funds and the fund is just sitting in the E2 business corporate bank account. The fund must be used before you submit the applications. How much investment is enough? Well, we'll discuss more details later over this presentation, but generally speaking, the question you should ask is, what kind of business are you starting? And what are the reasonable startup costs for the type of business? And if you come up with the numbers that you are appropriate for the business starting cost, that's the number you should invest. But generally speaking, we usually recommend at least $50,000 or more. You also need to prove that investment funds are coming from the legit source. For example, if your funds are coming from sale of a property, then you will need to submit a signed contract, a closing documentation, bank statement showing the deposit of net proceed from the transaction. Those all kind of documentation should be provided to prove that the fund is coming from the legit source of sale of property. For this matter, please keep in mind that government wants to see kind of clear fund flows from the documentations. Well, consulars offices are kind of, a little less care about the fund flows than USCIS, but still, you need to show how fund was originated and came to the E-2 business account, or how the money was used. So you should try hard, keep it simple and easy for the government officers to understand how funds were originated and used. Business also must be real and operating. What it means is that when you arrive in United States with your E-2 visa, your business must be able to immediately start operating. So it is not like you are going to get E-2 visa first and then come to the United States and establish your own business. No, it goes the other way around. Your business should have been already established and in order to apply and get an approval for E-2 visa. To this element is satisfied, you will usually need to submit, for example, like sign the commercial lease agreement, business entity registration document, company website, maybe MOU or contracts with the potential customers, license if your business is kind of contractors or construction business. Those are the examples that you need. Hiring US workers. Well, probably that's the main reason why US government is giving out an E-2 visa for foreign nationals. It is, in order to boost the US economy. So you should hire US workers once your E-2 visa is approved. And having US workers on your company's payroll is one of the critical issues for your E-2 visa renewal. You could even hire and employ US workers before you apply for the E-2 visa, and actually such would strengthen your E-2 visa case. So you should keep in mind about it. E-2 visa also requires to have an intent to return to your home country upon expiration of your E-2 visa. Please remember that E-2 visa is not a green card. It's not permanent residence and does not automatically lead to green card either. It only allows you to enter the United States for the temporary period to develop and run your E-2 business. But it does not mean you cannot renew your E-2 visa or obtain permanent residency. You could. You could renew the E-2 visa. Eventually, you could go after U.S. permanent residency, but you should carefully design the case direction with the immigration attorney for that matter. Okay. Next slide. So options of obtaining E-2 visa. There are two ways to approach your E-2 visa case. One is to start your own business, and second is purchasing an existing business. First option is basically you need to do everything from the scratch. You will have to register corporation in the State Department, sign the lease agreement for the office space. You need to do many things to have a business up and running. Second option is buy an existing business. Buying an existing business also has two ways. One, you could go through the sales transaction before your E-2 visa is approved. which will be riskier option because you already own the business and transaction is already closed and you are not authorized to run it yet. So somebody else in the United States need to run the business for you while you are going through the visa application. Another option for buying an existing business is going through the escrow arrangement. This means all the terms and conditions are fully satisfied except visa approval. So escrow agent will hold the purchase money, and once confirmed that your E-2 visa is approved, then agent will release the money to the seller. However, E-2 visa application is denied, then money will go back to buyer you. So it will give you more protection and options. So it could be more attractive options for you. How long is the E-2 visa valid? Well, it depends on the treaty agreement between the United States and the foreign country. It could be very short, like 3 months, or maximum like 5 years. Then what does that mean? If I get E-2 visa only valid for 3 months, then do I have to close down my E-2 business and leave the United States in 3 months? No. Regardless of the visa validity duration on your passport, you will typically get 2 years of E-2 status when you come to the United States. So you could run your E-2 business for next 2 years, but once you go out from the United States territory, then you will have to reapply and renew your E-2 visa again. So please make sure to understand the difference between visa and status. A visa is more like admission ticket to the United States, but once you are inside the United States, your authorized duration of stay is not governed by visa anymore. The CBP's I-94 form will decide the actual duration. For E-2 visa, again, CBP officers will usually give you for 2 years every time you re-enter the United States. So even if, for example, even if you have 5 years of E-2 visa, you may need to make another international traveling at least a couple of times to renew your I-94 duration. So it is very important to check your I-94 record every time you enter the United States. Next slide. So let's talk about how much investment is enough. This is a very common question, and please keep in mind that there is no minimum set of investment amount. In EB5 permanent residency case category, there is actual minimum investment amount set by regulations, but that's not the case for the E-2 visa. But you have to invest substantial amount of money. And that depends on, again, the type of business you are starting. Also it depending on where you are applying, because each consular post applies slightly different review standards, and overall strength of your case matters as well. The government also uses a proportionality test. What it means is that if startup cost for example, consulting service, let's say it is a consulting service. In that case, maybe $50,000, and government you spend the $50,000 as an investment fund. Then government wants to see that you have spent very high percentage of total investment fund. But on the other hand, if your business is, for example, let's say a pharmaceutical factory that needs millions and millions of dollars, to even start, then you could just invest very lower percentage of total amount before you submit the applications. More example may be like, let's say you need $5 million for, to build a pharmaceutical factory, and then you have invested only $1 million so far. That's like only 20% of the required total startup cost. The government will actually agree that such is substantial enough to meet the requirement. Okay. So if you are buying a business, you need to consider that whether purchase price you are paying is fair market value. Okay. Please note that government doesn't like to see a situation where an investor is buying a business for very unreasonably low price. So you will need to demonstrate that the purchase price actually reflects fair market value. In tricky situation, you may want to obtain a third-party business valuation report, but it is usually not required. If you are buying a business, you also need to watch out for a seller financing situation, which is often problematic for E2 visa case. It is because you are not allowed to use E2 business's asset as a security collateral. For example, let's say you invest only 50% of the total purchase price. That's only half of purchase price out of your pocket. Having the other 50% from seller's financing. Then government usually believes that you have not substantially invested in the business because seller's financing is secured by E2 business's assets. Okay, so keep in mind about the risk of having seller's financing. Franchise are good options for E2 visa as well. It could be either you are buying an existing business or starting new franchise business in a brand new location. Either way is fine. This type of arrangement is good to prove that there is a proven business model and promised future incomes based on the franchise's already existing reputations, right? So you also need to think about where you are going to spend the money. Uh, there are good and bad expenditures. There are some types of expenses that considered as stronger and some of them weaker. For example, let's say your travel expenses, hotel accommodation fees, meals, like business meeting with the vendor, partners or potential investors. Those are considered as weak and bad expenditures. But purchase of, let's say, computers, equipment, like leasing commercial office space, paying security deposit, first month's rent fee, paying the already hired employee's salary, those are considered as very strong and good expenditures. Sometimes we get a question whether a home office is acceptable and paying a home mortgage is considered as an E2 expenditure. We do not recommend a home office for your E2 visa application. Although you could make an argument about why your business type does not need a commercial office space, unfortunately, government does not usually buy this type of argument, and they have been very conservative about this particular issue. Okay. Next slide. Do I have to hire U.S. employees? The answer is yes. The whole point, again, for E2 visa is creating jobs and contributing local economy in the United States. So if your E2 business is barely making incomes just to cover your family's expenses, living costs, then obviously government would not like it. Therefore, it is very important that your E2 business creates enough incomes to hire and pay those US workers' salaries. So this means your application should prove that you are not going to operate your business as a solo owner and solo employee. Okay, some people operate their business without any employees. They feel like that's unnecessary have employees, but E2 visa work. Please keep in mind you have to hire U.S. workers. We generally recommend that your business plan shows you are going to hire at least 3 to 5 full-time employees within 5 years, depending on type of business though. But that's kind of a common range that we have seen. You can even hire an employee before you apply for the E2 business. Now again, such would actually strengthen your E2 visa application. Sometimes people ask whether there is a difference between W2 employees and 1099 contractors status. Generally, it is recommended and a lot better to have a W2 employee status for your E2 business. but also depending on type of business. For example, if you are in construction industry and where hiring subcontractors are very common and usual, and it is okay to pay their fees with a 1099 arrangement. But even if so, your main business, construction business, should have at least couple of full-time W-2 employees. So the point is, it is not good at all if your business only operate based by the on only 1099 contractors. Okay. If your business is a new business, then you can prove that your intention to hire U.S. workers in the future by business plan. If you are buying an existing business, then you will need to submit W-2s, pay stubs, tax returns. So you should carefully choose which business you are going to buy. If the existing business did not have any employees previously, only had a couple of 1099 contractors in previous years, and then in that case, such is not a good candidate for your E2 business at all. Okay. So with that in mind, let me turn it over to Kelly, who will guide you through more next part of our presentation. She'll cover how to build up and improve your E2 visa application. So please stay tuned.
Thank you. All right, so let's talk about some business plan considerations and what your E2 business plan should contain. So, first, it should have an executive summary that clearly outlines who are you, what do you do, who do you sell to. Sometimes the officer will really only focus on the executive summary and then the personnel plan and the financials. So, you really want the executive summary to be very clear, and an officer should come away from it understanding what it is that your business does. You also want to include a market analysis, research. Who's the market you're going to serve, a marketing plan to explain how you intend to get clients. Most businesses will need at least some type of website, some type of marketing, and so it should be really clear what your plan is there. There'll also be a focus on your personnel plan, and you should include 5 years of hiring projections. We recommend usually having at least 3 to 4 full-time employees by year 5, and a few of those employees should be hired kind of earlier on in the process. Um, and then you also want kind of 5 years of financial projections, which would include a balance sheet, an income statement, and a cash flow statement. And so all of these are kind of the main pieces that they're going to focus on, for the E2 business plan. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some E2 visa considerations, common questions that we get. So one is, should you apply with USCIS for a change of status, or should you apply for an E2 visa at a consulate? And with USCIS, this is only available to someone who's already in the United States in a valid status that allows you to change status. So for example, let's say you've entered on ESTA. A change of status with USCIS is not available to you because ESTA doesn't allow a change of status. But perhaps you are, here on an H-1B and you want to start your own company, or you've entered on a B-1 to kind of explore your options, and now for whatever reason that, it makes more sense for you to apply from within the United States, then you might do a USCIS filing. It's important to know that when you do a change of status, you're not going to get a visa stamp in your passport that allows for international travel. You will get a 2-year approval. So the maximum you can get is 2 years. And that allows you to stay in the United States, work here, run the company. You won't have to attend an interview. So for some people, this can be kind of a more attractive option. However, again, you won't get that multi-year kind of visa stamp in your passport, which is available to many applicants. If you apply at a consulate, in contrast, you will get that visa stamp in your passport. For many people, entrepreneurs, they do need to travel, so this can be a kind of a more attractive option. Also, if you're, living in your home country, you don't have a visa to the United States yet, then a consulate may be kind of your only option. There's a lot of benefits to the consulate. You do because you do have an interview. That means you also have an ability to, advocate for your business. So when you go to that interview, you have an ability to talk to the officer, answer any questions they have, explain why your business is going to be successful. And then again, for many applicants, you'll get kind of a multi-year visa up to 5 years that can allow you to come in and out of the United States and run the business. So it gives you kind of a longer time frame for many applicants. There are some where, your visa is issued for a much shorter duration. For example, Bangladesh or Egypt. If you're a national of those countries, you'll get a 3-month visa. But when you enter, as Yongki explained earlier, you will get kind of 2 years in E2 status. But so it's always good to talk to your attorney about, what are your options with a change of status or with the consulate, because it can differ, based on your specific facts. Source and trail of funds. So particularly if you're doing a filing with USCIS, they do tend to look extremely closely at the source and trail of funds and almost do like a complete audit from the source all the way through to you spending the money. So, for example, if you earned your money, from savings from employment, it wouldn't be enough to just show the tax returns and then, proof of spending the money. They would actually want to see the tax returns, bank statements, pay slips showing your payroll entering your bank account and being maintained there. If it was transferred anywhere, you would need to show where it was transferred, and then all the way up until it's actually transferred to the E2 business bank account and spent. For a consulate, they tend to take a much more high level view of the source and trail of funds. If it is savings from employment and you have tax returns showing sufficient income for the investment amount, they all will, just look at that. And they won't focus so much on such a detailed audit trail. Most consulates also have page limits. So you're kind of including something where they're looking at a more holistic, high level view as opposed to really in the weeds of exactly where every dollar went. So if you do have an extremely complex source and trail of funds, you transferred your money multiple places, a consular filing may be a better option than USCIS. That being said, USCIS can be more favorable towards lower investment amounts, than a consulate. So consulates often want to see at least, 50, 60,000 invested and spent. And that's only for kind of a service-based business that would allow for that low investment. For a business that has kind of, more requirements like a restaurant or, a manufacturer, you're going to have to spend much more. USCIS, if it makes sense for the business, can accept investments much lower, maybe even as low as 30,000, 40,000. Again, that can be very risky, but is doable, based on our recent experience. Um, in terms of source of funds, you can use a loan, but it cannot be secured by the assets of the E2 company. And so where we see this show up is in kind of seller financing situations, maybe where you're purchasing a business and maybe you put down, 50% of the purchase price and the rest is seller financing. Usually in that situation, the security for that loan is the assets of the E2 business. And even if there's a personal guarantee attached to it underneath, that's often not enough to overcome this hurdle where they will not think you've invested a substantial amount because you've only really put 50,000 at risk, and then the rest of it is, or I'm sorry, 50% at risk, and then the rest of it is secured by the E2, business. Gifts are permissible as a source of funds for the E2, but the gift giver has to be willing to provide their financial documentation to show where they got the money. So, for example, let's say one of your parents is giving you a gift and it's from a sale of their property. They have to feel comfortable providing you with the sale documents, the proof of them receiving the money, and the proof of them transferring the money to you. Um, so when you considerations for a small investment amount, and we do have a separate webinar that goes over kind of in detail, in more depth, how to deal with small investment amounts. But when you have a small investment amount, you want to make sure that every other part of the application is as strong as possible. So this is going to mean maybe you get letters of intent, memorandums of understanding, maybe preliminary contracts that show that you will have immediate, kind of clientele and cash flow to help support the business, even if it has a lower initial investment or working capital. It can also be helpful to get maybe a letter from a CPA who's reviewed your investment and your business plan and works regularly with small companies in your industry who can issue an opinion that explains, yes, this is substantial for this type of business. This can be successful. Um, E2 visas for two investors. So it is possible to do this, but it would have to be a 50-50 ownership split. If it wasn't a 50-50 ownership split and the partners have the same nationality, you could potentially look at doing a E2 investor and an E2 employee application. If they don't have the same nationality, then the only split you could do would be 50-50, and both partners would individually need to invest a substantial amount. Um, all right, substantive changes to the business after filing. So this is an important one. Sometimes people will get a visa, maybe they get a 4-year, 5-year visa, and they think, great, I can work in the United States. So the E2 is more limited than that. The E2 allows you to work for the business that is listed on your visa that you presented at the consulate. And it allows you to do what you represented in that business plan and in that application. So if you started, a wedding photography business and now you've closed that down and you're running a restaurant, that's a substantial change, which would mean you're violating your status. So before you make a change that massive, you do need to either go back to the consulate and, get a new visa or do an amendment with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And that's before you start the new business line. Um, if you do know you want to have multiple business lines, like for example, sometimes we have clients doing software consulting, but they know down the line they want to develop a mobile app. You can build that into your business plan so that you are able to add that service line over time and it won't be considered, a substantive change. Also important to know that if there's kind of natural outgrowths of your business, like let's say you're a wedding, photographer, but now you're also going to do, family portraits and kind of build out your professional photography studio farther, that could really be described as a natural outgrowth of the business and maybe not a substantial change. The important thing is if you're considering adding new service lines or really changing the way that your business operates, talk to your attorney first to understand what the risks are. And if you do have, plans for lots of different businesses, try as much as possible to contemplate that in your initial application to give you the most flexibility and freedom later on. So for higher risk cases, there are certain types of E2s that when you go in, you already kind of know you're going to be getting scrutiny on that application. One would be real estate. This is partially because there's sometimes a misunderstanding that you can just buy a property or buy a couple properties, and that alone is a substantial investment. And that doesn't meet the real and operating requirement for the E2. So if you're doing a real estate business, it's really important that you show this business is going to operate. It's going to have, revenue. It's going to be able to hire employees. That's something you want to build into your business plan. Real estate can also have a lot of licensing requirements, particularly if you're doing things like construction. So make sure you're kind of doing that research ahead of time. Sometimes there's certain licenses you can't get until you have a social security number. So maybe you need to partner with some other local business organizations, but do that research in advance. Equity trading is another one that they will look at with scrutiny. A lot of similar issues to real estate, where they are concerned, do you have the licenses? Are you just doing personal trading for yourself? What is the structure of the company? So keep that in mind when you're doing that type of business. Another high risk case would be if you're purchasing a business from a family member. So generally for the purchase price, they will consider that the fair market value that the business is offered for will be considered substantial. However, if you're buying a business from a family member, they're going to wonder, is this really the fair market value of the business? So in that instance, it's really a good idea to get some type of objective valuation, maybe from a valuation company, from a CPA that explains here's what the purchase price is based on. And it should be based on kind of the numbers, the financials of the business. If the business is, wildly successful, and you're only paying $25,000 for a 50% share, they're not going to accept that. They really want to see that you're investing a substantial amount in light of the actual, reality of the business. All right. So common reasons for E2 denials. So one would be low investment amount. While there are are strategies you can use, to kind of strengthen cases with lower investment amounts. Some investments are just too low. A case comes to mind where a client had spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. So that $98,000 is not committed funds. The total investment was considered to be 2,000. That's just too low. So you do, even if you have a business that you really could start, without spending much, to a certain extent, you do need to spend, to get the visa to show that you are really committed to the business and that you've spent everything necessary to get the business up and running. Low investment amount, if you do have a lot of working capital, can be kind of one of the easier denial reasons to overcome. You can spend more money and, kind of get your visa. So that example of the person who spent $2,000, they came to us after they got their denial, and we were able to advise them. They ended up spending around 50,000 with 50,000 as working capital, and their visa was ultimately approved. The nature of the business is another reason potentially for a denial. We've already talked about in the last slide, real estate, equity. These are things where, they may just look at it more closely, and you need to do more work to convince them that you meet the requirements. Filing location is a very important one. So not all consulates are, even though the law is the same, they're not processing E-2s in the same way. There are some consulates that are very familiar with kind of small businesses. They're friendlier to small businesses like London, like Toronto. And there's some consulates that are used to seeing much larger multinational companies that are often, just bringing in lots of employees and maybe have spent millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And those consulates may be less friendly to kind of the small investor. There's also some consulates that just don't process E-2 visas a lot. Um, Additionally, consular officers rotate and there can be trends at different consulates. All of this is to say it's very important to talk to your attorney to understand what is going on at your particular consulate where you'll be filing, because, again, like there's certain things you may want to consider. Maybe even though hiring isn't required before, you file, there are certain consulates that are really focused on that. So it may help you to do so, even though at other consulates that wouldn't be necessary. There's also kind of, starting last year, people have to apply at the consulate either in their country of residence or nationality. So there's less flexibility than there used to be, and you want to just make sure you know what your options are. Another reason for denial, the next two are kind of related. These are marginality concerns. So, will you hire workers in the United States? Usually, for a startup, a business plan is sufficient. However, if you've run a similar company in your home country for many years and you never hired anyone, it may be a good idea to hire someone before you file, because they just may not believe you based on your work history that you're actually going to hire someone, even if you have, a good business plan. Um, Issues with the adjudicating officer. So, officers are human beings. They have different levels of training and experience. They have different, kind of trends going on or guidance they're receiving. The officer does have complete discretion over whether to grant or deny the visa. You want to make a good impression, even if you feel they're being aggressive or rude. You want to be as polite as possible. And then, after you leave, the interview, if it didn't go well, you would want to kind of write down everything that happened at the interview so that your attorney can help you kind of look at what happened and maybe refile. And if you do refile, most consulates will try to give you a different officer. It's not guaranteed, but it is something that they generally try to do. Another reason might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So sometimes people will file on their own, or perhaps with an attorney who's not as experienced in kind of the particular E-2 requirements. And they might do things like the treaty country national doesn't own 50% of the business, or the entire transaction is, secured by a loan that's secured by the assets of the E-2 business. So in that case, you'd have to just revisit the filing. And the good news is, you can refile your case. Okay, so what does it take to renew an E-2 visa? So as Yongki pointed out earlier in the presentation, hiring workers is one of the biggest pieces of the E-2 visa program. When you go to renew your visa, they will want to see that you have hired workers. Again, we generally recommend at least 3 to 5 full-time employees by year 5 of operations. We've regularly processed renewals where people have less than that, but If you have fewer employees than that, you really want to explain what has happened with the company. Perhaps maybe over the 5 years, you have hired maybe six, seven people, but just because of employee turnover or, financial issues, you only currently have one or two employees. But you really want to develop the narrative of the company, and hiring more people is much better because many consulates, especially ones that do E-2s very frequently, for a renewal, they really just want to see what do the tax returns look like, what do the W-2s and payroll summary look like, and that's really their biggest concern. Um, so they will look for that updated financial data. Many consulates will ask for tax returns for 2 years. Some will ask for tax returns for 5 years if you were issued a 5-year visa. They'll want to know, is the company profitable? If it's been running at a loss consistently, how is it continuing to operate? What does the current payroll look like? If the company is not doing well, maybe you include kind of a shorter version of an updated business plan that shows how you're going to get that company back on track. We did that a lot in the years kind of post COVID when people were renewing in 2021, or where they're having issues with kind of just all the impacts on the industries. Also important to show that the company still meets the E-2 requirements. So the company is still owned, at least 50% by the E-2 investor, by treaty country nationals, and that any changes to the type of business are not substantial. So like we talked about, you didn't have a wedding photography business and now you're showing up for a renewal with a restaurant. But if there was a natural, outgrowth to the business, like you're a marketing agency, you were going to focus on finance clients and instead you found a niche in the art world, that's fine. Okay, so some developments and adjudication trends and considerations. E-2 visas have generally high approval rates, 80 to 90%, as posted by the government. And this has generally continued, even throughout different administrations. Again, it is a favorable program because it does bring investment, it does bring jobs. That being said, there is enhanced vetting and scrutiny across all visa types at this time. So you do want to keep that in mind. Very important, make your investment purchases in the US when it's possible. It's not a requirement in the law, but it does really help your case. And we do find that officers will sometimes ask about this. There's particularly concern if maybe you've paid for a lot of subcontractors that are not in the United States. I think that they could see that and be concerned, are you really going to hire workers in the US? So to the extent possible, you want to make, as many of the investments in the United States as you can. We also, anticipate, and this has just been a trend over time, that, they'll continue to want higher investment amounts, so, maybe 10 years ago, an investment of maybe spending 15,000 and having the rest as working capital might have worked at certain consulates. Now it's kind of much higher that they expect to see. Hiring US citizens is very important. So when you do go to renew, they will look at, there's a form where they will ask, how many of your employees are US citizens? How many are legal permanent residents? How many are visa holders? And it's more favorable, to hire kind of US citizens or legal permanent residents if it's possible to do so. You want to focus on employees rather than contractors. So there are certain industries where if you're paying kind of hundreds of thousands of dollars to subcontractors, you can use that in an argument to say that your business isn't marginal. But even in those industries, we really strongly recommend you have at least one to two, W-2 employees because that's going to be viewed more positively than contractors. And if you're in an industry where there's normally employees and not contractors, or you're paying very low amounts to contractors, then you really need to have those employees. So administrative processing, this is something that we're seeing a lot more. Again, we're in an era of enforcement, of kind of enhanced vetting of all applications. There's kind of a few different types of administrative processing. One is more easily resolved. That's where they say, we can't approve you today because we need some additional documents from you. Please send them to us, and then we'll review. So that is in the control of the consulate. You can give them your documents. Usually within a month or two, it's resolved as long as they're happy with the paperwork. Another administrative processing, kind of thing that can happen is that your case has been flagged for either a security advisory opinion or there's an issue with maybe a name match, or some other type of agency has flagged the case. And when that happens, really all you can do is kind of continue to follow up every few weeks or, even every month or so, because at that point, the consulate doesn't have the ability to move the case forward. They are just waiting for a clearance, from this other outside agency. So if you are someone who has ever had a criminal issue, is coming from a country where there are kind of, issues with the United States, you can anticipate, even if you were approved for a visa in the past, it's very likely you could be put into administrative processing upon renewal. Um, we are, more USCIS filings. I think this was a trend that started after COVID, and kind of has continued. People are often more reluctant to leave the United States, if they feel there's going to be any issues at the consulates. So you do, if USCIS is an option for you, you're in the US in a status that allows a change or extension, this could be a good option. That being said, just remember that, they will look at the source and trail of funds very closely, and you won't get that visa stamp that allows international travel. There's also longer waits at consulates. This is always a moving target. Consulates will kind of get better, get worse. However, you do want to plan in advance, always looking at a time scale of months, not weeks, because, the foreign service staff, are being cut. And so there are kind of less officers for more cases. All
Okay.
right.
That's very helpful and informative presentation. Thank you, Kelly. Now let's take a look at some questions.
Okay. So someone's asked, can you give examples for starting a business while waiting for E-2 approval for someone who is abroad and does not have permission to make money in the United States? Please describe the steps to open a business in the US. Let's say it's a handyman business. Yeah, so I think these are related, so we can kind of address them together, which is basically, if you want to open a business in the United States, you are allowed to be an owner of a business, as a foreign national. You are just not allowed to work at that business. For many, there's many kind of service, companies that can open the business for you. We also offer that service. That being said, people can also do it themselves, as many states allow for a complete online filing. For example, in New York State, if you want to open a corporation or an LLC, you will go to their, division of corporation website and follow the steps, and you can file everything online. After the business is opened, you would need to apply for a tax ID. If you have a social security number, that can be done through the IRS website, or you can do it through filing something called an SS4 with the IRS. And then you would need to visit the United States to open up your US business bank account. So there are a lot of things that can kind of be done abroad. Usually, our clients who are living abroad need to take at least 1 to 2 trips to the United States, maybe to have a business meeting with the bank, maybe meet with their landlord if they're going to get a commercial lease, maybe explore the market, get a feel for, the business community they're going to join. That being said, it is very possible to do, the majority of steps, from abroad. I think the one you really can't do from abroad is opening up that US business bank account, as you do generally need to have all the corporate documentation and they want to meet you in person. But, again, many of our clients do handle this. And if you have specific questions about your situation, you please always feel free to set up a consultation with us. We'd love to speak with you. All right. Someone says, I'm currently living in Canada. I do not intend to reside permanently in the US. My plan is to visit the US once a month. Does this travel pattern impact my E-2 visa application or approval? So, it is fine to get the E-2 visa and not live in the United States permanently, but just visit on, on business. That's fine. I don't think there's any issue with that. If the question is you don't have the E-2 visa yet, then a pattern of, the frequency and duration of your visits, coming in as a business visitor, they may eventually, ask that you get that E-2 visa, so that you can actually come in and work. But it is fine to get your E-2 visa, have the company running in the US, and you primarily live in Canada and visit, to work, each month. All right. I have an E-2 for the last 2 years. I have 3 more years left. I had 4 staff, but only have one. And my wife and I are having a hard time finding people and keeping them, worried about renewal. Business is doing really well. Yeah. So I think that when you have had for staff and you have someone when you're doing the renewal and the financials look good, and if you can show that you're really trying to hire, I think that that can be a viable case for renewal. It's really important to kind of build the narrative, to make sure that you have the W-2s, the payroll for all the prior years, and that you're able to explain why it is that you're struggling to hire. And if you can get at least one more person besides, you and your wife, so you have you and your wife and then two employees when you go to renew, and the business is doing well, I think that can be a good case for renewal. It's just going to be really important that you explain the narrative of kind of why it is that it's been hard to hire and show that you've been making efforts to hire. So get proof of those job postings and things like that. All
Okay,
right.
that's all. Thank you everyone for taking time to join today's webinar. We hope this session helped clarify key aspects of the E2 visa process. And if you'd like to discuss your situation in more detail, please feel free to schedule a consultation with us. We would be happy to continue our conversation. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to speaking to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.